Last week, Nikki Tonsky published this article. I saw some friends of mine sharing it, and I think it reached the top of Hacker News, and it was all about how some long-held UX standards are slowly changing. So checkboxes and radio buttons have forever been held as these conventions, and over time they've slowly started to change. And this has been really solidified by the release of the Apple Vision Pro, where one of the guidelines in their UX documentation is to use circle input elements for checkboxes. I found it super interesting to see how these UI elements have changed over time and evolved, and I learned loads about why you should use and shouldn't use different input elements. And I wanted to share that here with you today. So here's what I learned. The first thing I learned is when to use a checkbox. Checkboxes are square and they often have a check mark inside, but not always. You can see these examples going all the way back in operating systems, back to Windows for Workgroups and macOS 7.5. So that's the early 90s, 93, 94. In all these examples, the check mark wasn't even there. Sometimes there was a cross in the box, but one thing remained consistent. The checkboxes were always square. And why were they square? Well, that's how you tell them apart from radio buttons. So radio buttons are circular, and if you've got a radio button, it means you can only have one selection. With checkboxes, you can select as few or as many as you want, but with radio buttons, you can only select one. And again, these have been circular going back as long as you can remember, basically. Here are examples going all the way back to Windows 1995. Jacob Nielsen points this out in an article he wrote in 2004, and he says these rules have been the same since the first edition of Inside Macintosh, published in 1984. And all subsequent GUI standards and W3C guidelines have had the same two definitions. A radio button is used when the options are mutually exclusive. You can only choose one. Whereas a checkbox is used when you can have more than one. This sounds simple enough, but over the last few years, this has been changing. So this has led to us seeing square radio buttons, circular checkboxes, and even in some bad places, combinations of both, where one input element looks the same but has different functionalities on the same page. Now, Nikki Tonsky's article argued that operating system vendors have always obeyed these long-held traditions, and it was only until recently with the Apple Vision Pro that standards have moved away. But actually, in the comments on this article on Hacker News, it was pointed out that if you look at the Notes app on iPhones, if you look at Gmail, you can see circular checkboxes have been cropping up again and again and again. Now, Nikki's article is a bit dramatic. He ends by saying Apple's betrayal means that things will never be the same again. But I think it's more important to take a step back and look at why it's important to get the right input element for the right use case. By making sure you use the right input element, it means that users will just have a better time. They'll know what to expect, and they'll feel less of that kind of uncomfortable uncertainty when things don't really work the way they expect them to. This is often not a conscious discomfort. Usually users won't be able to label why they think something's not working right, but they'll have less trust in the product or service because it's not acting like how all other products and services they usually use act. And if you stick around to the end, I'll tell you why Apple has changed to using circular checkboxes. So when researching this video, the next thing I found was about toggle switches and single checkboxes. So I found this really useful diagram from the Nielsen-Norman group. And what this says is that if a user can choose between on or off, you should always use either a single checkbox or a toggle switch. And in order to decide whether to use a single toggle checkbox or a switch, you basically have to look at what action that checkbox is doing. If that input element is leading to an immediate response where the whole interface changes based on what you've just done, then you should use a toggle switch. And an example of this is turning on airplane mode. When you hit that toggle switch, instantly the phone changes to airplane mode. You can see the feedback up in the top corner and you know that it's happened. Whereas if you have to press submit form or go to another page, you should use a checkbox instead of using a toggle switch. The final thing I learned is when you're using a radio button, you should always use a default option. If you don't know what kind of default your user might expect, you should do some research and find out what a sensible default might be. So this Nielsen-Norman article gives lots of examples about how different default options might help your users go on a more recommended route, or it might sway them to make a particular decision. And it gives examples to do with charitable donation or setting up new software. But the thing which really stood out to me was that once you've ticked a radio button option, there's no way to undo it. You can't uncheck. You just have to pick a different one there. And again, this can lead to a sense of frustration from the user. It goes against one of those usability heuristics of giving users control, giving them freedom to make actions. And if you have a set of radio buttons where you don't have a default selected, once a user clicks into that, there's no way for them to undo that selection without refreshing the page, because there's no way to unselect one. Maybe you should have a radio button which says none, depending on what your use case is. I'd never seen this advice before, and I think it's so important. So I would always say have a default selected when you're using radio buttons. So these are 3 quick lessons on how to make your input elements fit best practices and modern standards. I don't think the square checkbox is going anywhere anytime soon, but I guess we'll see what happens. And just to end, here's a really interesting tidbit I found in a Hacker News comment about why the Apple Vision Pro is promoting circular checkboxes. The Apple Vision Pro uses your eyes to control the user interface, and as you look around, you select things by where your pupil focuses. And it's much harder to focus on the center of a checkbox, because when you look at a square, your eyes focus in on the corner. So because of that, they changed checkboxes to be circular so that your eyes would gravitate towards the center, stopping you from misclicking on lots of things. So that was a super interesting thing that I found out, and it might mean that user interface standards change over time. But for now, I would definitely stick to square checkboxes, circular radio buttons. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure you hit like or share it with a friend, and please do subscribe. It really helps me as I try and grow this channel. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.